In a palace where bloodlines meant purity, love was considered a sin. Behind marble walls dripping with gold, a young girl's laughter once echoed, pure, innocent, unaware that her family's name would soon become her curse. History remembers kings and queens for their crowns, but not for the crimes hidden beneath their silks. The empire she was born into worshipped blood, not love. Every child was a symbol of legacy, every marriage a transaction of power. But when the heart of one royal girl strayed where it should not have, the walls of the palace became her prison. What began as affection turned into accusation, and soon horror. This is not the tale written in royal archives or whispered in classrooms. This is the buried truth of a girl forced to carry her brother's child, and the empire that chose silence over mercy. To understand her fate, you must first understand the world that built it. This was an empire born not from compassion or reason, but from obsession. Obsession with blood, with purity, with the illusion that their lineage was carved by divine hands. Every ruler believed their veins carried the breath of gods, that even a drop of common blood would poison centuries of perfection. The palace walls were painted with stories of holy birth and heavenly right, a theater of power masquerading as faith. In this empire, marriages were not unions of love but transactions of survival. Daughters were promises, sons were weapons, and wombs were the property of the crown. Each birth was inspected, recorded, and celebrated only if it strengthened the chain of divine inheritance. The royal priests preached that the gods favored those who kept their blood untainted, a doctrine so cruel it turned family into a breeding ground of fear. From the outside, the empire shone like paradise. Its architecture, its festivals, its scholars, all spoke of enlightenment. Yet beneath that brilliance lay a sickness that fed on control. Behind every wedding was a negotiation. Behind every smile, a command. The queen's beauty was worshipped, the king's power feared, and the children were raised to serve legacies, not dreams. Even the gods, carved in marble across palace corridors, seemed to watch with approval as this twisted devotion grew. Generations passed, and the obsession deepened. Marriages between cousins became a royal custom, an act disguised as divine duty. The priests declared it sacred. The scholars called it tradition. But it was neither holiness nor heritage. It was fear. Fear that outsiders might claim the throne, that the empire's purity would dissolve if love strayed beyond its borders. And so, purity became poison, one that flowed quietly through every royal vein. Those who questioned the law of blood were silenced. Some vanished into monasteries, others into dungeons no one spoke of. Mothers were warned to guard their daughters not from strangers, but from those inside the palace. Fathers chose political advantage over morality. And somewhere, amid this carefully constructed cage, one young girl born of royal descent would pay the highest price for their sins. From the moment of her birth, her destiny was decided. The astrologers declared her a divine omen, a child of golden lineage. Her cradle was carved from ivory, her milk served from silver bowls. The people adored her. Poets compared her to moonlight. Yet within the palace, her value was measured not by her laughter, but by the purity of her blood. To her family, she was not a daughter. She was an heirloom. The empire's hierarchy revolved around this perverse devotion to blood. Families outside the palace mimicked royal customs, arranging marriages between relatives to keep their line pure. The result was a society that confused devotion with decay. Diseases spread through generations, both of the body and of the mind. But instead of seeing their corruption, they called it divine inheritance. The more their people suffered, the more they insisted the gods were testing their faith. It was a system too sacred to challenge and too dangerous to question. The empire's records spoke endlessly of victories and divine births, but never of what happened behind locked doors. The silence was not ignorance, it was policy. Royal scribes erased anything that hinted at shame. They called it preserving the honor of the crown. But in truth, it was burying humanity beneath ritual. And beneath those rituals, something darker began to fester. The young princess, still a child, was surrounded by men who saw her as the key to preserving their divine claim. To them, her body was not hers. It was the vessel of future power. Every touch of affection was disguised as duty, every violation cloaked in ritual. The empire's priests stood as witnesses, not protectors, ensuring that the law of blood was obeyed, no matter the cost. The ideology that made this possible was simple yet horrifying. If divine blood came from within, then love must never come from outside. This was not corruption, it was doctrine. The more twisted the act, the more sacred it was deemed. It wasn't about faith anymore. It was about control. The empire had turned divinity into an excuse, religion into a weapon, and children into tools of legacy. And so, the same kingdom that built temples to worship purity became a graveyard of innocence. Its marble pillars stood high, but beneath them were bones of those sacrificed to tradition. This empire of obsession believed it was preserving divinity. In reality, it was perfecting sin. And in its pursuit of perfection, it was about to create its most horrifying tragedy. The night when blood, love, and power would all become one. She was born beneath the glow of torches that never dimmed, in a chamber perfumed with sandalwood and whispers of prophecy. The night of her birth was marked by celestial alignment, the moon and the royal star converging, something the court astrologers declared a divine sign. To the empire, she wasn't a child. She was a symbol, proof that the gods still favored their rulers. Bells rang across the capital, priests chanted blessings, and the palace gates opened to distribute gold to the poor. But beneath the noise of celebration, the queen's face was still, because in this empire, a daughter was both a blessing and a warning. From the moment her eyes opened, the young princess belonged not to her mother, but to the crown. Her cradle was embroidered with threads of gold, her sheets woven with hymns from holy scripts. Servants moved in silence, instructed never to touch her unless permitted. Even her first breath was recorded, the exact hour, minute, and second, to calculate her destined purpose. No one ever asked what kind of person she might become. They only asked what her blood might preserve. Her mother, the queen, loved her in secret. In public, she called her the empire's daughter, not her own. Every smile was restrained, every embrace forbidden. The priest said too much affection could taint the child's spirit. And so, the princess grew up surrounded by warmth she could never touch. Silk cushions, gold toys, chandeliers that bathed her in light. Yet none of it could fill the hollowness where love should have lived. By the time she could walk, she was already being watched. Tutors, attendants, spiritual advisors, all assigned not to teach her, but to mold her. Her lessons began before dawn. She learned the art of silence, the weight of her posture, and the way to hide her emotions behind grace. Her childhood was a performance, rehearsed and perfected. Laughter was treated as weakness, curiosity as rebellion. When she asked about the world beyond the palace walls, she was told, "The world exists to serve your name." Still, she was a child, and sometimes the child in her refused to obey. At night, she would sneak to the window and watch the servants in the courtyards, the laughter of the commoners, the rhythm of life untouched by ceremony. She would press her face against the cold marble and wonder what freedom felt like. But even that small act of curiosity was dangerous. Once, a maid caught her whispering to the night guards, asking about their families. By morning, the maid was gone. The lesson was clear. Even her questions carried consequence. Inside the palace, everyone bowed to her, but not out of affection. To them, she was not a person. She was a vessel of divine continuation, the thread that kept the empire's lineage unbroken. Her name was never spoken casually. It was recited like a prayer. When she turned 7, the court astrologers performed a ritual to bind her destiny. Incense filled the air as a high priest tied a golden thread around her wrist, declaring that her life belonged to the gods. But in truth, it belonged to men, the same men who would one day decide who touched her, who claimed her, who used her to ensure the purity of their blood. Her father, the emperor, was a figure of awe and terror. To the world, he was a symbol of divine justice. To his daughter, He was a shadow that swallowed entire rooms. He spoke to her rarely, and when he did, it was to remind her of her duty. "You were born to preserve what others envy," he told her once, his hand heavy on her shoulder. "You are the blood of gods. You must never let it mix with the dirt of men." The words carved themselves into her memory, a prophecy disguised as advice. The older she grew, the smaller her world became. The gardens she once played in became forbidden after dusk. The tutors were replaced by priests who spoke of discipline and obedience. Her meals were monitored, her movements recorded. Every aspect of her existence was documented in the royal archives: what she ate, how long she slept, the number of words she spoke in a day. She was not living. She was being studied. And yet, in the quiet corners of her solitude, she found fragments of defiance. Sometimes, she would sneak into the palace library, a place meant only for scholars and priests, and read stories of ancient queens who ruled with wisdom and rebellion. She read about women who defied gods and built kingdoms from ashes. She admired them, not knowing that the same empire that praised those stories would crush her for even dreaming of the same freedom. Her reflection in the mirror became both her comfort and her enemy. The attendants often told her she resembled the goddess of fertility, a face destined to bear divine heirs. She hated those words. Even as a child, she understood their meaning. Her body was already a prophecy, her future already decided. Every glance, every whisper, every ritual reminded her that her value existed only in what she could produce. When she turned 12, her innocence was ceremoniously sealed. A grand ritual was held, attended by nobles, priests, and foreign envoys. The emperor stood beside her, declaring that her purity was the pride of the empire. As drums thundered and priests chanted, she stood motionless, dressed in white silk that shimmered like moonlight. Inside, she wanted to scream, but she had long learned that her silence was the only thing she truly owned. Outside the palace, the people celebrated her as a symbol of holiness. Inside, she became the centerpiece of a darker obsession. The astrologers spoke of her divine fertility. The priests called her the chosen womb. The whispers grew louder. She would one day ensure that the god's blood never left the palace walls. The idea of love, choice, or freedom never entered their prayers. Thus, before she ever became a woman, she was stripped of her childhood. She was not raised to dream, to love, or to live. She was raised to continue a lie that claimed blood could be divine, and that humanity could be controlled through fear. The girl who should have been a daughter became a destiny instead. And as the empire watched her grow, they did not see a child. They saw a future sacrifice, wrapped in silk, crowned in prophecy, and marked by blood long before her first sin was ever committed. He was born 3 years before her, the sun to her moon, the heir to the empire's sacred bloodline. When the midwives lifted him for the first time, the court astrologer knelt and whispered, "The gods return through this one." From that moment, his life stopped belonging to him. The prince was not raised as a child but as a future deity wrapped in flesh. The empire called him the living son, a boy destined to rule over men and be worshipped like the divine. Where his sister was kept in isolation, the prince grew under the blinding light of expectation. His tutors came from the most learned corners of the empire, philosophers, generals, priests, all teaching him not knowledge but control. He learned that empathy was weakness, that love clouded judgment, and that his blood made him something above human. Yet, beneath all the divine titles and rigid lessons, he longed for something pure, the one person in the palace who looked at him not with fear, but with familiarity. His sister. When they were children, they met only under supervision. They were allowed to play together for a single hour each week, within the walled gardens guarded by silent sentries. To her, he was warmth, someone who listened, who shared stories of the world outside their golden prison. To him, she was innocence, the only person who didn't bow, didn't tremble when he spoke. They were fragments of light within each other's cages. But even their bond was studied. Every laugh, every word exchanged was watched by the priests. When the emperor heard of their closeness, he summoned the prince privately. "You may protect her," he said coldly, "but never forget, she belongs to the gods, not to you." It was meant as a warning, but to the boy those words twisted into something else entirely. If she belonged to the gods and he was their living son, didn't that mean she belonged to him? As the prince grew, the empire built his image into legend. Bards sang of his brilliance, poets wrote of his divine beauty, and soldiers swore oaths in his name. Yet, behind the grandeur, the palace priests whispered new doctrines, that divine purity could only be preserved through the sacred union of blood. At first, he dismissed it as ritual rhetoric. But slowly, he began to see the pattern. Every royal marriage he learned about had been carefully crafted. Cousins, half-siblings, uncles and nieces, all in the name of preserving divinity. The empire called it devotion. He began to see it as destiny. When he turned 16, the shift began. The emperor grew colder, the queen more withdrawn. The palace became a place of silence and scrutiny. The prince, now tall and sharp-eyed, carried himself with a confidence that frightened his advisers. They feared him not for his power, but for the belief in his own sanctity. He had begun to absorb the empire's sickness, mistaking its poison for divine purpose. Then came the Festival of Ascension, a ceremony marking his transition from heir to spiritual sovereign. The priests placed a crown of thorns dipped in gold upon his head, declaring that his bloodline carried the will of the gods. In the sea of worshippers, his eyes found hers. His sister, standing at the edge of the hall, wrapped in white silk. Their gazes met for a moment that felt eternal. In that instant, the distance between them shattered. What began as a child's affection had become something darker, more desperate. The boundaries of right and wrong had long been erased by doctrine. The empire told him that divinity existed only in his blood, and that any dilution was sacrilege. Every law, every ritual reinforced one truth: the royal blood must remain untouched by outsiders. And so, when he looked at her, beautiful, isolated, pure, he no longer saw his sister. He saw the vessel of purity, the mirror of his own sanctity. At first, he fought it. He would avoid her during meals, cut their conversations short, refuse her gaze. But she didn't understand the change. She only saw her brother becoming distant, colder, and more burdened by the invisible chains of expectation. When she asked him what was wrong, he couldn't answer. He wanted to protect her, but every word he'd ever been taught screamed that she was his to protect by possession. The more he resisted, the deeper the guilt sank, until it began to feel like duty. The priests saw this turmoil and exploited it. They began to feed him scriptures, ancient verses about divine unions between siblings of gods. They told him that his hesitation was defiance, that only through sacred union could the gods' favor endure. "Your father united bloodlines through war," they whispered. "You will do it through flesh." The prince stopped sleeping, his dreams filled with distorted images, his sister's face glowing with divine light, her voice whispering prayers he couldn't understand. When he visited her again, months later, she barely recognized him. The warmth was gone from his eyes. He spoke not as a brother, but as a priest, repeating the same holy words she'd heard all her life. "We were chosen," he said quietly. "Our blood was meant to stay pure." She laughed at first, thinking it was a cruel joke. But when he took her hand and she felt the trembling in his fingers, she realized it wasn't. Their meetings became rarer after that. The palace walls grew tighter, as though sensing the corruption taking root within them. Servants spoke in whispers, sensing that something had shifted in the air. A tension, a heaviness that made even the torches flicker differently. The siblings who once played among the jasmine vines now lived as strangers, bound by fate and fear. The prince became the empire's golden image, flawless in public, broken in private. His speeches to the people echoed faith and devotion, yet his nights were haunted by guilt. He prayed to the gods to take away the temptation, but they remained silent. He began to believe that their silence was a sign of approval. By the time he turned 18, the transformation was complete. The boy who once protected his sister had become the embodiment of the very system that destroyed them both. He no longer questioned the teachings. He enforced them. He no longer felt guilt. He called it destiny. And when the priests finally came to him with the prophecy that the divine balance could only be restored through a union of pure blood, he didn't protest. He bowed his head, because by then, the line between sin and duty no longer existed. The brother had vanished, leaving behind a prince who believed that love was sacred only when it was forbidden, and that purity could only be preserved through sacrifice. In the empire's vast libraries, where scrolls were stacked like bricks of gold, the law of blood was written not in ink, but in prophecy. It was said that the gods themselves had chosen the royal line, and that their divine essence flowed only through one sacred family. To question that belief was treason, to defy it was blasphemy. And so, across generations, this idea became doctrine, passed from one emperor to another like a crown of chains. It began centuries before the princess and her brother were even born, when kings were not yet called divine, and power was still fragile. The empire's priests realized something terrifyingly simple. If they could convince the people that royal blood carried divine power, then every ruler's cruelty could be justified as destiny. The first divine marriage, as the scriptures told, was not of love, but of fear. When a dying king had no heir, his high priest declared that his sister was chosen by the gods to bear the pure flame. From that moment on, the sacred lie became the foundation of the throne. By the time the current emperor ruled, the law of blood was not just belief, it was governance. Priests quoted the holy verses. From the same seed was born both the sun and moon, and only by reunion shall the heavens stay whole. Scholars debated it in the academies, carving divine logic into human sin. Even poets celebrated it, writing hymns that turned incest into devotion. The empire didn't just tolerate this horror, it glorified it. Advisors around the throne knew exactly what they were doing. They understood that divine lineage was a weapon sharper than any blade. If the emperor's blood was God-touched, then every act of tyranny could be framed as divine will. If the royal family kept their lineage sealed, then no outsider could ever claim the right to rule. Purity wasn't about faith, it was about control. The priests guarded this illusion like sacred fire, feeding it to the people one sermon at a time. Inside the palace, rituals reinforced the myth. Each royal child was subjected to ceremonial purification, where priests declared that their veins carried the breath of the gods. No one spoke of what those rituals truly were: nights of seclusion, strange chants, and binding oaths that erased the concept of choice. For the princess, those early ceremonies were terrifying shadows she didn't understand. Only later would she realize they were preparing her for something far worse. The law was simple in words but monstrous in practice. Divinity cannot mix with mortality. Every royal was to marry within the bloodline, to ensure that the empire's soul remained unbroken. Advisors and priests debated the wording endlessly, not because they doubted its morality, but because they sought ways to justify it further. They cited ancient empires where gods married their sisters, mothers, or daughters. They argued that blood was the vessel of creation, that through sacred union, the gods themselves renewed their power. The emperor, however, saw beyond the religion. For him, it was politics. By binding his children to one another, he eliminated rivals and secured absolute control over the throne. No foreign prince could claim alliance through marriage. No noble could tie his lineage to the crown. The royal house became a closed circle, perfect, impenetrable, and poisoned. And yet, behind the marble walls and golden draperies, that circle reeked of decay. The royal physicians knew what the priests would not admit. Generations of inbreeding were destroying the family from within. Infants were born deformed, heirs fell ill without reason, and madness began to spread like an inherited curse. But the priests silenced them, calling it divine trial. To question the law was to insult the gods. To suggest change was to invite execution. The princess was never asked what she wanted. Her life was scripted by men who spoke in the language of holiness. When the idea of her union with her brother was first proposed, it came not as a discussion, but as a decree. A scroll was delivered to her chamber, sealed with the emperor's mark. The words were written in the voice of the divine, but she recognized her father's hand behind them. The letter spoke of destiny, purity, and the honor of sacrifice. It called her the vessel of renewal, and her brother the keeper of divinity. It said their union would please the gods, secure the throne, and cleanse the blood of human corruption. She read the words over and over, her hands trembling, until the ink blurred with her tears. Her attendants watched in silence, too afraid to comfort her. In public, the court celebrated. Priests declared the upcoming sacred joining as the greatest blessing in a century. Artists began painting murals of divine twins from mythology, subtly conditioning the people to accept what was coming. Poets composed hymns comparing the royal siblings to celestial beings destined to reunite. Every public announcement masked the horror with beauty, silencing outrage before it could even exist. But inside her chamber, the princess's world began to collapse. Her body, once treated as sacred, now felt like a prison. Every step she took was shadowed by expectation. The maids whispered prayers, not for her protection, but for her purity to remain unbroken. Even the food she ate was selected to maintain balance for fertility. She wasn't a daughter or even a woman anymore. She was an offering. The priests came to her daily, reading verses about divine purpose. They spoke softly, their words dripping with false comfort. The gods do not burden those they do not favor, one told her. Another said, your womb is the bridge between heaven and earth. She stared blankly as they recited blessings that felt like curses. The more they spoke of divinity, the more she felt erased. Meanwhile, the prince was drowning under the same illusions. The same priests whispered in his ear, convincing him that his doubts were signs of impurity. They showed him ancient scrolls, diagrams of celestial unions, prophecies of renewal through blood. The pressure built until even his resistance began to break. He began to see the horror not as sin, but as duty. His love for his sister twisted into something sacred, or at least, that's what they made him believe. And so, in the eyes of the empire, what was about to happen was not a violation. It was a ceremony. Invitations were sent to noble families. The Temple of Union was cleansed with oil and fire. Musicians rehearsed hymns of purity. The empire would not see a forced act of incest. They would see the restoration of divine order. The princess, on the other hand, could only watch as the world built her cage in gold. Every wall around her glittered. Every robe shimmered. Every priest smiled. But behind the luxury, she felt the cold truth. She had no voice, no body of her own. The empire had turned her into a symbol, and symbols do not scream. On the day of the decree's public reading, the people gathered outside the palace, chanting praises. From her balcony, she could see the crowd, faces full of devotion, blind to the cruelty beneath their worship. Her brother stood beside her, pale but resolute, his eyes avoiding hers. Between them stood the emperor, smiling with divine authority. The gods have chosen, he declared, his voice echoing through the marble courtyard. And we obey. In that moment, the law of blood was no longer myth, it was a living sentence. A kingdom applauded while a young girl's humanity was stripped away, replaced by divine fiction. The priests called it purity. The emperor called it duty. The people called it faith. But to her, it was something far simpler. It was the beginning of her end. Night fell over the empire like a shroud. The palace corridors, usually bright with chatter and music, were muted under a suffocating stillness. The air smelled of oil and incense, the scent of purity, they called it. Torches flickered along the marble walls, their light stretching like trembling veins across the floor. Every corner of the temple glowed in gold and red, not from celebration, but from something colder, ritual. That night was to be remembered as divine. The priests had decreed it so. The royal astrologers had chosen the hour when the moon would hang at its highest. A perfect symbol, they said, of purity being restored. And so, under that moon, a young girl was led through the silent halls, her fate disguised as ceremony. She walked barefoot, her silk gown dragging behind her like a trail of surrender. Her hair was braided in the style reserved for goddesses, not women. Her attendants whispered blessings she could barely hear over the pounding of her heart. Every step toward the temple felt like descending into something sacred and profane at once. She tried to breathe, but even air felt forbidden now. Guards stood on either side of the temple gates, their eyes fixed forward. They didn't look at her, they didn't dare. To see her fear would make them complicit. To acknowledge her humanity would shatter the illusion they had sworn to protect. Inside, the priests were already chanting, their voices echoing like low thunder. The sound was ancient, powerful, and merciless. The temple itself was a masterpiece of cruelty disguised as faith. Marble floors polished to mirror perfection reflected the golden idols of gods who watched without pity. Candles burned in every direction, their flames trembling in rhythm with the chants. In the center stood a raised dais draped in white silk, the altar of divine reunion. It was there she was to become the empire's offering. When she entered, the priests bowed low, not to her, but to the idea of her, the vessel of divine blood. Their eyes glowed with the ecstasy of conviction. The high priest approached, an elderly man whose voice carried the authority of scripture. He held a golden staff carved with serpents, its tip glinting in the candlelight. "My child," he said softly, almost tenderly, "tonight you become more than flesh, you become eternity." She wanted to run. Every instinct in her screamed to turn back. But the guards behind her closed the door, sealing the temple with a thud that echoed through her bones. Her brother was already inside, standing near the altar, dressed in white robes, his face pale as ash. He couldn't meet her eyes. The same fear that consumed her had devoured him too, but his chains were heavier. He had been told all his life that this was destiny, and destiny was not to be questioned. The priests began their procession, circling the altar, waving censers that spilled thick smoke into the air. The chants grew louder, the words ancient and indecipherable. Drums began to pound in slow, deliberate rhythm, the heartbeat of the gods, they said. The sound filled every inch of the chamber until it felt as though the walls themselves were breathing. The high priest raised his hands. The chanting stopped. Silence, heavy and holy, fell. He turned to the prince and the princess, his voice trembling with what he believed was divine ecstasy. "Through this union," he proclaimed, "the heavens are restored. The blood of gods, divided by time, shall become one again. Purity shall triumph over chaos." Two attendants approached the girl and began removing her jewelry, piece by piece. Gold bangles, anklets, the necklace her mother once placed around her neck. Each ornament clattered softly against the marble, the sound sharp and final. Then they lifted her veil. The room seemed to grow colder. The high priest placed his hand on her head and whispered a prayer of cleansing. His breath smelled of wine and decay. "You are not mortal," he murmured. "You are the bridge between worlds. Do not resist what the gods have written." She looked toward her brother, her lips trembling. For a brief moment, she saw him as he once was, the boy who used to bring her flowers from the garden, who laughed at her fear of thunder. But now his face was blank, his soul swallowed by duty. The drums began again. Faster now. The priests resumed their chanting, louder, almost feverish. Candles flickered wildly, their flames stretching toward the ceiling as if desperate to escape. The high priest raised the golden staff above them, the serpents carved into it gleaming like living things. "Let the divine blood flow as it was in the beginning," he cried. The world blurred. The sound, the light, the smoke. Everything became one unbearable wave. The girl's body froze as the ceremony became what it truly was. Not a ritual of divinity, but of domination. The temple doors shook with the chants of priests and the pounding of drums. Her quiet sobs drowned beneath them, turning into whispers swallowed by incense. No one spoke of pain that night. They called it purification. No one saw violation, only devotion. The priests recorded it as a holy union, a blessing to the throne. The emperor himself knelt outside, thanking the gods for preserving his dynasty. And when the dawn finally broke, the people were told that the heavens had rejoiced. But inside the temple, there was no rejoicing, only silence. The kind of silence that follows after screams too soft to be heard. When the ceremony ended, the priests withdrew one by one, leaving behind the smell of smoke and sanctity. The golden altar, once glowing, now looked stained. The girl lay motionless, her eyes open but empty, her soul retreating to some place beyond reach. Her brother knelt beside her, shaking, his face wet with tears he could never admit. Outside, the bells of celebration began to ring. The empire cheered. Poets composed verses about divine union. Artists painted the scene in gold and white, and the priests declared that the gods had smiled upon their land once more. No one would ever know what truly happened in that temple, and those who did were bound to silence. By dawn, the empire's scribes had already begun their work. Records were written in elegant prose, describing the night as the restoration of divine order. The high priest signed it with trembling hands, knowing that history would preserve the lie. In the official archives, it would be remembered as the most sacred night in generations. But for the girl, it was not divine, it was death in disguise. A death of innocence, of choice, of voice. The next morning, she was carried through the palace halls, her face hidden beneath a veil. The servants bowed as she passed, murmuring blessings, unaware that beneath that silk, the gods they worshipped had devoured another soul. Her body lived, but her spirit was gone, swallowed by the empire's hunger for purity. The priests called it a miracle. The people called it destiny. The emperor called it victory. Only the girl knew it for what it truly was, silence. And silence was the only sound the empire could never hear. Dawn came quietly, as if afraid to wake what had been buried the night before. The palace courtyards filled with the smell of roses and incense, a fragrance meant to purify, but which only masked decay. Servants moved like ghosts, avoiding each other's eyes, their whispers dissolving into the morning mist. The empire had declared a miracle, but those who had seen the queen's daughter carried to her chambers knew they were witnessing a curse dressed in gold. She did not leave her room for days. Curtains were drawn, candles burned to their stubs, and silence clung to the air like dust. The girl who once filled corridors with laughter now sat motionless by the window, her eyes hollow and distant. The world outside celebrated her. Priests sang hymns of divine motherhood. Poets compared her to celestial goddesses. Yet within those walls, she was barely breathing. Her body trembled with each breath, and her heart carried the weight of a sin she never chose. The physicians were ordered to visit her daily. They called her condition fragile holiness. The empire forbade them from using words like trauma or pain. Every tear she shed was called a sign of divine purification. Her sickness was not to be treated, it was to be revered. When she cried out at night, her attendants pretended not to hear. The priests had forbidden any comfort that might weaken her spirit. Instead, they left scrolls of prayers at her bedside and sprinkled holy water on her sheets. Pain, they said, is proof of the gods' touch. Yet among the servants, whispers began to stir. One maid, young and defiant, swore she heard the princess whisper a name, her brother's name, through tears. Another claimed she saw the prince outside her chamber, pacing endlessly, haunted by something he could not undo. But such words were dangerous. The palace had eyes everywhere. By nightfall, those who whispered too loudly were replaced, quietly, permanently. Outside, the empire rejoiced. The priests announced that the royal line had been blessed with continuation. Bells rang from the great temple, and offerings poured in from every province. Paintings were commissioned, the princess depicted in radiant white, her hands over her stomach, her face serene and saint-like. None of the artists had ever seen her in person. They painted the version of her the empire demanded. Pure, divine, silent. But behind her chamber door, the truth was unbearable. Her body weakened with each passing day. She stopped eating. The physician prescribed broth and honey, but she turned away, whispering, "Let the gods feed their creation." When she slept, she dreamed of fire. The temple, the chants, the faces watching as her life was stripped away. Sometimes she woke screaming. Sometimes she didn't wake at all until noon, her pulse faint as her breath. Her only solace came from the maid who dared to defy the priests. The girl would sneak in at night, bringing fresh water and stolen letters, notes of comfort written in the prince's hand. They were short, trembling apologies inked with guilt. "I was told it was duty. I see your face in every prayer they force me to say. Forgive me, though I cannot forgive myself." The princess never replied, but she kept the letters hidden beneath her mattress, close to where her heart used to beat with hope. As the months passed, her body began to swell, the sign of divine conception. The court rejoiced, throwing banquets in her honor. The emperor ordered a golden cradle to be forged, declaring that the child would inherit both blood and godhood. But no one saw the mother-to-be. She remained locked away, watched by priests who recited scripture while she wept. Her diary, found years later in a sealed chest, revealed the truth no priest would admit. "They say I am blessed. I feel nothing but rot. I am no mother. I am a tomb the gods forgot to close. They worship me, but I am their sacrifice. Every prayer outside my window is another nail in my coffin. The gods they praise are deaf. Only the silence listens." Even the prince's presence vanished. Rumor claimed he had been sent to a distant province. Others whispered he had gone mad. One guard swore he saw him kneeling in the temple courtyard, begging the gods to reverse what had been done. His pleas, like hers, went unanswered. When the time came for her to give birth, the palace cloaked itself in holy ritual. The temple bells rang again, echoing through the dawn. The priests prepared their blessings, the emperor prepared his speech, and the people gathered outside, chanting hymns of divine renewal. Inside her chamber, the scene was anything but divine. Hours of pain twisted into screams that no amount of incense could mask. The priests forbade the use of medicine. "The gods must guide the birth," they said. Blood stained the silks, her cries faded to gasps, and the chamber filled with the metallic scent of mortality. When it was over, the midwife emerged pale, trembling, her hands shaking. The priests declared, "A miracle is born," but no one dared to ask what that miracle cost. The princess never saw the child. Her body, frail and fevered, collapsed hours later. The empire would write that she returned to the heavens in peace, her sacrifice securing eternal prosperity. Her name became legend, the Holy Mother of the Empire. Statues were raised, temples renamed, and prayers rewritten in her honor. The truth was sealed behind marble and ink. But among the servants, her story lived on. One maid, the same who had brought her letters, vanished days after her death. Before she disappeared, she left behind a single piece of parchment hidden beneath the princess's bed. They buried her in silk, but the earth will remember the blood. Years later, travelers spoke of a ghost wandering the palace halls. A woman in white, her hands reaching out as if searching for something lost. The priests denied it, of course. The emperor ordered silence. But those who worked by candlelight in the palace swore that sometimes, when the night was still, they could hear soft knocking from the old royal chamber. 3 knocks. Pause. Then silence, the same silence that had begun it all. And though the empire tried to erase her, her name was whispered still, carried by those who dared to speak truth in the shadows. The girl who was never a sinner, only a sacrifice. The palace bells began to ring before dawn, their hollow tones rolling through the fog like a prophecy. The priests called it the day of divine renewal, the day the empire's blood would purify itself through pain. Servants hurried through marbled corridors, carrying bowls of oil, silk linens, and sacred herbs. Each step echoed against the cold stone walls, and yet, beneath the grandeur, there was an unease no one dared name aloud. Behind the towering bronze doors of the royal birthing chamber, incense burned so thick it turned the air heavy. Candles lined every surface, hundreds of them. Their trembling flames mirrored in golden mirrors, multiplying the illusion of heavenly light. But the light was not merciful. It revealed everything. The princess lay upon the ceremonial bed, pale, drenched in sweat, and barely conscious. Her lips moved, but her voice was too faint to reach the women who surrounded her. Her hands clutched the blood-stained sheets, her nails digging into fabric as pain ripped through her body in waves that defied words. Outside, the crowd cheered for a miracle. Inside, the miracle was dying to be born. The priests stood at the edge of the chamber, their robes glistening with jewels, their eyes cold and detached. They recited verses that had been used for centuries. From divine seed springs eternal glory. Their chants grew louder each time her screams did. To them, her agony was not tragedy. It was a sacred performance, a ritual reaffirming the purity of their empire. Do not intervene, one priest warned the midwife. Her suffering is the God's will. Do not rob them of their offering. The midwife nodded, though her hands trembled. She was old enough to know that the gods the priests spoke of were not merciful. She leaned close to the princess's face and whispered, "Hold on, my lady. Just hold on." The princess's eyes fluttered open. Through the blur of pain, she saw the flicker of flames, the shifting silhouettes of priests, the shadow of the golden cradle waiting beside her. It gleamed with inhuman beauty, carved with symbols of serpents and suns, polished until it reflected her face distorted and broken. "Is this what they call purity?" she whispered. No one answered. Hours dragged by like centuries. Her cries turned hoarse, her body shuddering under the strain. The priests began to sing hymns louder, drowning the sounds of mortal pain with the noise of divine celebration. One of them lifted his staff and declared, "The child of heaven comes through the vessel of flesh." Her head rolled to the side. Her breath came in ragged gasps. "Not heaven," she murmured. "Only hell." When the first cry finally came, thin, sharp, and defiant, the chamber froze. For a brief second, even the chanting stopped. The priests looked at one another, eyes wide, as though hearing the voice of prophecy itself. Then, like a wave breaking, they erupted in exultation. "The heir is born," one of them cried. "The blood of the divine flows again." The midwife lifted the child, trembling. It was small, frail, yet its cry cut through the room like a blade. The princess tried to lift her head, but her strength failed. The world around her blurred into sound and light. She heard them blessing the child, pouring holy oil on its forehead, marking it with symbols older than memory. "May this child carry the will of the gods," said the high priest. "May the empire bow to his sacred blood." The princess turned her head slightly. Her lips moved again. "My child, my curse." No one brought the baby to her. Instead, the priests took it to the golden cradle, lifting it high for the others to see. The midwife glanced back at her, her face torn between duty and compassion. "She needs rest," the old woman whispered. But rest was not mercy, it was escape. The princess drifted between waking and oblivion, her mind trapped in flashes. The flicker of candlelight, the echo of chanting, the sound of her child's first cry, a cry she both loved and feared. Outside, fireworks burst over the capital. The empire rejoiced. Bells tolled from every temple, and priests announced that the gods had smiled once more upon the royal line. Courtiers raised goblets of wine and toasted the purest heir ever born. No one spoke of the mother. Back inside, the child was placed in the cradle, a masterpiece of craftsmanship, lined with white silk and gold thread. The priests surrounded it, their hands lifted in benediction. "A child born of divine unity," they declared, "a symbol of perfection, a bridge between heaven and earth." But as the incense thickened, one priest stepped closer, peering into the cradle. His face changed, a flicker of unease crossing his practiced serenity. The others noticed. "What is it?" whispered another. The elder priest shook his head. "Nothing. The child bears the mark of purity." But he was lying. Beneath the swaddle of silk, the newborn bore a faint, dark birthmark, a strange, twisting shape across its chest, like a bruise that refused to fade. It resembled the old forbidden sigil, a symbol that, centuries ago, had been called the mark of the unholy union. They covered it quickly. "Do not speak of this," the elder warned. "It is not a flaw. It is a sign." That night, while the empire celebrated, The midwife returned to the chamber alone. The princess still lay unconscious, her breathing shallow. The old woman approached the cradle. The child slept quietly, its tiny hand twitching in dreams. Born from love that was never love, the midwife whispered. Born from purity that was only power. She touched the cradle, her old fingers brushing against the gold. They will worship you, little one, but not because they love you, because they fear what you are. In the days that followed, the empire's hypocrisy reached its peak. The priests paraded the infant before crowds, declaring it the living proof of divine favor. The emperor stood before thousands, lifting the child as banners waved and drums thundered. Our blood is unbroken, he shouted. The people roared in approval, unaware that the mother who gave life lay between life and death behind palace walls. The princess awoke once, only once, after the birth. Her body was weak, her voice a whisper. The midwife placed a hand on her shoulder. The child lives, she said softly. A tear rolled down the princess's cheek. Then the curse continues. She turned her head toward the window, where sunlight spilled across the floor like liquid gold. Tell him, when he's old enough to ask, that his mother tried to stop the gods. Those were her last words. The empire announced her death the next morning. The official story said she had ascended peacefully to the divine realm. Her funeral was a spectacle of sanctity. Priests chanting, nobles weeping, and statues draped in white. No one spoke of her suffering. No one dared mention that her blood had stained the cradle of their salvation. The child grew under the watch of priests who whispered of destiny. They said he was chosen, blessed, perfect. But when he looked into mirrors, he would later see the shadow of that mark upon his chest, the symbol of the truth the empire tried to erase. And so, the purest heir became the empire's greatest secret. His birth, hailed as holy, was in truth the echo of a crime too monstrous to name. Every prayer said in his honor was a lie built upon another lie, every hymn a veil to hide the screams that brought him into the world. Outside the palace walls, life went on. But the walls remembered. The bed where she suffered was never used again. The chamber was sealed, its doors shut with iron locks. Some said that on quiet nights, the cradle still rocked on its own, moved not by wind, but by the restless spirit of a mother who never got to hold her child. And the priests, even as they grew old, avoided that corridor. For they knew the truth they had buried beneath gold and glory, that the purest blood in history was born from the darkest sin. History has a way of protecting the powerful. The truth does not disappear, it is buried. Layer by layer, like the dust that settles on old scrolls, it is covered until it suffocates beneath the weight of official glory. And that is precisely what happened to her story. The official chronicles, commissioned by the royal scribes, told a tale of divinity. They described a sacred union between the emperor's chosen heirs, destined by the gods to preserve the bloodline of heaven. The princess was remembered not as a victim, but as a saint, the mother of purity. Every document, every inscription carved into temple marble, sang of her devotion, her grace, her willing sacrifice. But beneath that manufactured holiness, something sinister pulsed. Foreign travelers who visited the empire decades later wrote of whispers they could not confirm, of a queen's daughter who was forced into ritual union, of a birth that was celebrated yet mourned in secret. Their accounts, written in the margins of journals, survived because they were too insignificant to censor. They were seen as foreign gossip. But together, these fragments formed a mosaic of horror that the empire had tried to erase. One Venetian merchant, writing around the time of the princess's death, noted, "There is a strange silence within the palace. They celebrate, yet their eyes tremble. I saw banners of gold and red, yet beneath them I heard the sound of weeping." For centuries, these words meant little. The empire controlled its image with precision. Artists were ordered to paint portraits of the Divine Mother, surrounded by halos and celestial light. Poets wrote hymns about her purity. Statues of her likeness stood in temples, her eyes carved to look upward, serene, submissive, holy. The empire's people learned to kneel before her image without ever knowing her pain. And so, for generations, the lie became history. But history, even when chained, has a pulse. And centuries later, cracks began to appear. It began with the discovery of a small chest, buried beneath the ruins of the old palace during a routine restoration. Inside were scrolls wrapped in silk that had blackened with age. The archivists believed they were temple records, but as they unrolled the fragile parchment, the ink told a different story. It was not written in the voice of a priest or scribe. It was written in a woman's trembling hand. They call it sacred, but I have seen her eyes. No god could demand such tears. The signature at the end was that of a midwife, the same woman who, according to forgotten notes, had served the royal household for more than 40 years. Her writings were not meant for the public. They were confessions, perhaps written in guilt or fear, hidden in the hope that one day the truth would surface. She described the night of the ritual, the candles, the chanting, the girl's fear. She described the child's birth, and the mark upon its chest that no priest would dare explain. Her words were raw, desperate, and utterly human. They sealed her cries within the temple walls, but I still hear them in my sleep. They call her blessed, but I know she was broken. The discovery sent shockwaves through the world of historians. But within the empire's borders, silence prevailed. The government restricted access to the site, claiming historical contamination. The documents were declared inauthentic, the product of foreign manipulation. And yet, in the underground academic circles of Europe, copies circulated like contraband relics. Then came the letters. A British archaeologist named Edward Carrington, who visited the region in the late 19th century, stumbled upon sealed correspondence inside a monastery near the ancient capital. The letters were written by a palace servant, a man named Ohan. They were addressed to a monk in exile. In them, Ohan wrote of the Divine Mother who was forbidden to speak, and of a child whose birth silenced the kingdom. They say she was chosen, he wrote, but if the gods chose her, then the gods are crueler than men. Carrington published excerpts in his field journal in 1873. Most readers dismissed it as Orientalist fiction. Yet the tone, the details, the consistency with the midwife's account, it all aligned. And for the first time, the legend began to fracture. Historians debated furiously. Orthodox scholars called it blasphemy, an attack on one of the holiest dynasties in recorded history. Revisionists called it revelation, proof that royal sanctity was built upon centuries of systemic abuse and manipulation. The question that haunted them all was simple. Could an empire truly rewrite its own sins into holiness? The answer was everywhere, in the art, in the architecture, in the silence of centuries. One painting in particular drew new scrutiny, an enormous fresco inside the royal chapel. It depicted the union of light, a man and woman kneeling before the gods, their faces serene. But under ultraviolet examination, restorers found another layer beneath. The woman's eyes had originally been open, not closed. Her expression was not peaceful, but terrified. The original artist, it seemed, had painted truth before being forced to erase it. The empire had rewritten even her face. Over time, archaeologists uncovered more evidence. Sealed rooms beneath the palace, filled with discarded ceremonial items. A crown with dark stains on its lining. A small cradle carved with the same forbidden symbol described in the midwife's scrolls. These relics whispered of rituals the empire called holy, but which now reeked of desperation and control. A new generation of scholars began calling her by a different name, the Silent Queen. They saw her not as a saint, but as a mirror of all the women history had erased, women sacrificed to the hunger of dynasties, buried beneath myths of duty and purity. And as more evidence surfaced, the empire's official narrative began to crumble. Schoolbooks quietly changed terminology. Sacred union became controversial tradition. Museum plaques replaced goddess with historical figure. It was subtle, almost invisible, but the shift had begun. Still, some resisted. The priesthood of the old temple denounced the discoveries as moral corruption by modern eyes. They claimed outsiders could never understand divine duty. Yet even among them, whispers spread, whispers that maybe, just maybe, the gods had never demanded such cruelty. In the end, Truth did not triumph through war or rebellion. It surfaced through time, persistence, and the refusal of silence. Historians pieced together letters, scrolls, foreign journals, and artifacts, like fragments of a shattered mirror. And when the image finally came together, it was not one of divinity, but of despair. The story of the girl who was forced to give birth to her brother's child became one of history's most disturbing examples of sacred propaganda. An empire had turned incest into ritual, rape into holiness, and a girl's suffering into scripture. For centuries, no one questioned it because the lie was too big to see. But lies rot, even beneath gold. Today, her true story survives not in temples or textbooks, but in the margins, in forbidden archives, whispered legends, and the hearts of those who search for truth beyond what power allows. And so, her silence has become its own rebellion. The empire that called her divine is gone, its monuments crumbling, its gods forgotten. But her story endures, not as myth but as a warning. Because history may bury its victims, but it cannot bury their echoes. And sometimes, those echoes are louder than the empires that tried to silence them. Empires may fade into dust, but their shadows stretch endlessly across time. What happened inside that palace centuries ago was not just the cruelty of one family. It was the blueprint of power itself. The story of the girl who gave birth to her brother's child was not an isolated tragedy. It was a reflection of how every empire, every system built on control, stains its own blood in the pursuit of perfection. Even now, her story lingers not in statues or scriptures, but in the structure of human history itself. Because power, when left unchecked, always returns to the same instinct: to own, to purify, to dominate. What began as divine law in ancient courts evolved into political ideology, into racial hierarchies, into the modern obsession with control disguised as morality. The empire that worshipped purity was only the first to dress violence as virtue. Throughout time, rulers have found ways to justify cruelty through the language of love and duty. Monarchs called it lineage. Churches called it faith. Nations called it progress. But under every polished justification lay the same ancient rot, the belief that some blood is worth more than others, and that suffering in the name of order is not only acceptable but sacred. In that sense, the queen's bloodline became more than royal. It became symbolic, the first drop of a poison that spread through generations. The empire's descendants continued to build their legacy atop that silence. They carried her image through art and prayer, never acknowledging the horror beneath. Yet, every royal wedding, every coronation, every carefully worded vow of divine blood whispered her name through history. The ritual that broke her body became myth, and myth became foundation. Even centuries later, when her empire had fallen and its temples lay in ruin, its ideology endured, reborn in other lands, in other languages. The obsession with blood purity took on new names. It hid behind genetics, behind nobility, behind heritage. The same logic that justified incest in the name of godhood justified genocide in the name of civilization. What began with one girl's silence became humanity's habit, the silencing of anyone whose existence exposed the truth that power is always built on someone's suffering. Her story is not ancient. It repeats itself in modern forms. The girl forced into marriage for family honor. The woman whose pain is disguised as tradition, the generations trapped under the weight of inherited obedience. The rituals have changed, the empires have new flags, but the blood still remembers. And that is the real legacy, not the dynasty she was forced to preserve, but the lineage of trauma she unwillingly birthed. When historians uncovered the truth, they didn't just expose a lost atrocity. They opened a wound that history had stitched shut with lies. It forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth: that civilization is often just barbarism in ceremonial robes. Every empire that claims moral superiority hides a chamber like hers, a place where love is rewritten as law, and innocence is sacrificed for power's continuity. Some scholars tried to rationalize her fate. They said she was a product of her time. But that phrase, that soft shield, hides a deeper cowardice. It assumes that cruelty belongs to the past, that modern man has outgrown the darkness. Yet the same forces that crushed her, patriarchy, obedience, silence, still rule, only better disguised. The world may not crown queens like her anymore, but it still demands women to bleed for men's honor. It still glorifies purity while condemning those who break it. It still rewards silence more than truth. And so, the empire she once feared never truly died. It evolved. It wears different faces now. Governments, corporations, religions, ideologies, all claiming righteousness while feeding on submission. When archaeologists unearthed her final resting place, they found her grave unmarked, her bones placed beneath a temple floor. Above her, carved in marble, was a prayer. May her sacrifice keep the blood pure. Even in death she served the lie. But the soil has a way of telling stories the stone refuses to admit. DNA testing confirmed what the empire denied. Her child, the so-called divine heir, bore genetic defects caused by generations of inbreeding. The blood they worshipped as sacred was already decaying. It was nature's rebellion, a quiet revenge written in flesh. Perhaps that is how history balances itself. Empires may suppress truth for centuries, but their sins manifest in their lineage, in the sickness of their heirs, in the madness that consumes their thrones. Every drop of tainted blood becomes a ghost that haunts the family line. And if we listen closely, those ghosts are still whispering. We hear them in the unmarked graves of child brides, in the forgotten hospital wards where forced sterilizations took place, in the homes where obedience is mistaken for virtue. Every era invents its own version of sacred blood, and every generation sacrifices someone to keep the illusion alive. That is why her story still matters, because it is not about incest or royalty or a forgotten empire. It is about the eternal hunger of power, to rewrite morality until cruelty feels holy, to make victims believe their pain is destiny, to convince the world that silence is devotion. But she is no longer silent. Every document unearthed, every letter translated, every scholar who dared to speak her name, they have given her what she was denied: truth. And truth, once spoken, is a form of resurrection. It is said that when the last of her statues was destroyed, villagers found the fragments still glowing faintly in the night. Whether myth or coincidence, they called it the bleeding stone. They believed her soul refused to rest, that she haunted the empire not in vengeance, but as a reminder that blood remembers everything, every betrayal, every wound, every silence. Empires fall, names fade, gold crumbles, but the blood they tainted never forgets. And that is her true legacy, not the dynasty, not the temple, not the child she was forced to bear. Her legacy is the echo that travels through time, whispering to every generation that builds its throne on the bodies of the innocent. It says, "Beware the gods you invent, for they will demand sacrifices you cannot bear. Beware the purity you worship, for it will rot you from within. And above all, beware the history you choose to forget, because empires fall, but the blood they tainted never forgets."